I talk a lot about little things that we take for granted in everyday life that become very important whenever you don't have them in present. This is because little things are big things. What I mean by that is that if there is an unimportant detail that you just go longer and longer without, the more important it becomes. I can't think of a better example of this phenomenon than music. You have to understand that while I was locked up in Mendocino County Jail fighting my case for over 9 months, there was no music, there were no radios, and you felt the absence of it. After that, I was at reception center at San Quentin for another month or so, and total I went almost a year without really listening to music at all, with the exception of the bus ride from Mendocino County Jail to San Quentin, which I've talked about before. There were a couple of notable exceptions. One that stands out is while I was in county jail, a news program on the Hispanic channel had started playing Sir Mix-a-Lot's Baby Got Back. And a number of inmates who recognized the song had immediately broken out in an impromptu rap session, I suppose. There had to be a half dozen guys singing back and forth at each other. It was pretty entertaining. And it really speaks to how starved some of us were for music. When I eventually arrived at High Desert, the phenomenon was very different. My cellie Blinky had a radio. We were on part of a progressive unlock. You see, there were racial tensions between the white and black inmates, and the administration was concerned that a riot was going to occur if too many inmates were allowed to program together at the same time. As a result, they decided to let just a couple of inmates from each race, the whites and the blacks, program together and then slowly increase the number of inmates that program together. If they started with just the shot callers and their cellies, let's say, and slowly increased the number of inmates allowed to program together, theoretically, if there was a riot, it would be a small one and maybe one could be prevented from happening at all. This was a fine plan, and whenever I arrived there, it meant that I wasn't going to come out of my cell and program for at least a couple of weeks after my cellie Blinky did, because he was a critical worker who had already finished the Cage Your Rage rehabilitation program. This was a correspondence course given to inmates at High Desert, and you wouldn't be allowed to program with the other inmates as part of the progressive unlock until you had finished the course. This meant that Blinky was outside of the cell for 6, 8, 12 hours a day, and I was just in there. He'd given me permission to use his TV and radio. I don't remember what songs I was listening to on his radio in this couple of weeks or month that I was stuck in the cell and he was allowed out. But I do remember that he came home one day and made a joke and asked if I was ever going to watch his TV because he didn't think I'd turned it on in weeks. I'd been too busy listening to his radio. I do remember one album that he had, a CD that I played again and again. It was No More Tears by Ozzy Osbourne, the song Mama, I'm Coming Home. I must have listened to that song for just days and days, which isn't really surprising. I guess it doesn't take a genius to realize I was homesick at this point. Music was a funny thing at High Desert because one thing there was none of was instruments. There were no guitars or keyboards or harmonicas on that yard because they could be fashioned into weapons. Later I had a cellie Wolf. This was a terrible hardship for him. He'd been a musician, he'd played guitar most of his life, and he really loved it. He had thousands of pages of guitar tablature and hundreds of pages of notes that he'd taken and articles that he'd cut out of guitar magazines, and no guitar. He was serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, and he wasn't going to be leaving that yard, he thought at the time, which essentially meant that he was going to die without ever using a guitar again, which it hurt him. He was sad about it. When I eventually parted ways with him, he had given me all of his guitar stuff, all of his music stuff, because I was going down to a 3-yard, and he asked that I make sure that it go to somebody who would really appreciate it, because he had an incredible amount of stuff saved, and he knew he was never going to get to use it again. When I did roll up and go to a 3-yard, I became SNY and went to New Corcoran. It was a very different environment. There were dozens, maybe over 100 guitars on that yard. And it was no big deal. You'd see 3 or 4 guys who brought guitars out just to have a informal jam session. One guy with a harmonica. There were a variety of instruments that you could get, but most inmates elected for the guitar. There was an elderly gentleman at SADF, Carlos, and he could play Spanish guitar, classic Spanish guitar, like a fish swims in water. It was truly incredible. Every day I would make a big lunch, much bigger than I could eat, and I would offer to share it with him and his friend Robbie, and I would sit there at lunch and listen to him play for a half hour or an hour, and I felt privileged to get to feed the man in exchange for listening to a couple of songs. I'm going to have to tell a story just about his musical talent one of these days. There was also an official band at SADF who practiced with the nice instruments that the administration had bought for the purpose of the yard band and concerts. They had electric guitars and a drum set, and they actually had speakers that they could hook up on the yard and occasionally do a concert. It was a real amazing thing to have access to in prison. But the instruments, they were new whenever they were bought, but they aged quickly, and inmates don't necessarily treat things that aren't theirs well. I recall approaching Phil Spector with an acquaintance of mine, the professor who was the MAC, the liaison between the warden and the inmates there at SADF, and asking if he would help us purchase new instruments for the yard, and that's a pretty interesting story that I guess I'm also going to have to tell. I have enough music stories related to my experiences with music in prison, that I think I'm just going to make next week Music Week. It's what I'll talk about for my next 3 videos, is some of the experiences that I had and what music means to inmates. I usually end my stories with a moral lesson. I try to draw out some experience that I had while incarcerated and maybe share it with my audience and hope that I can share something I learned. This video I'm going to do is something a little different, and I'm just going to ask that anybody who has the time, take the time to listen to their favorite song. We all have that one favorite song that's just guaranteed to make us tap our toes, to get us in a better mood, that if we listen to it at the right moment, it just changes where we are. After going so long without music, I try to every day, or at least most days, go over my list of songs and try and listen to 1 or 2 of the ones that really just change my emotional state and make my day better. What's more magical than music's ability to transform where we are emotionally? Take the time, take the moment, listen to this song, and just imagine what it would be like to not listen to it, not listen to any music for months or years. My experience was not unique in that I went almost a year without listening to music. There's guys who went back in the shoe who went years and years without listening to it. It seems like a small thing, but small things become big things, and unimportant things become important whenever they're unfulfilled.